A woman's hand, pale, tense, rests against the cheek of a soldier. He does not move. No flinch. No gaze returned. No sound. His eyes, hidden beneath the shadow of a bearskin hat, remain fixed on the horizon. A red mark begins to rise on his face. Behind him, the Union flag wavers in a child's grip. The boy doesn't speak. No one does. Not because they agree, but because something about that stillness says more than any protest ever could. She said nothing after it. Not an apology. Not a retreat. Not even a breath of regret. The slap had been swift, intentional, clean. But the response she expected never came. No raised voice. No return of force. Only stillness. A silence that didn't make sense. A silence that didn't belong to a man being humiliated. It belonged to something older. Something deeper. People began to notice. Not her voice. Loud, entitled, unraveled. But his quiet. The child lowered his flag. Not out of sadness, but in some instinct he couldn't name. The pigeons stopped circling. The tourists stopped filming. Even the wind, just for a moment, seemed to forget its path. There was weight in that pause, not because a soldier had been struck, but because a human being had chosen not to strike back. And in that choice, in that refusal, came a discomfort no one could hide from. Not in the woman's eyes, not in the bystanders, not even in the stone beneath their feet. Sometimes, silence is not emptiness. Sometimes, silence is everything we didn't want to see, made visible. His name was Edward Talmor, 42, a sergeant, a medic. Once he ran through sandstorms to stop blood with bare hands. Once he whispered names to the dying, not to save them, but to make sure someone remembered they were here. Once he held a man together, long enough for that man to say goodbye. Edward knows how to scream. He knows how to break. But after Mali, after Iraq, after one too many, we couldn't save him. He asked for silence. Not because he feared sound, but because he feared what might come out of him if he ever answered again. They gave him the uniform, the posture, the duty. They told him, just stand, don't react, don't speak. And for once, that wasn't punishment. It was mercy, for a man who had already given too much. The scars beneath his collar were not medals. The medals across his chest were not just decorations. Every button, every crease, every morning routine was a ritual, not to look sharp, but to stay whole. Because some men survive war by learning how to vanish in plain sight. She didn't know his name. She didn't ask. To her, he was not a person. He was a symbol, a backdrop, a piece of silent tradition placed there to decorate her story. She had missed the tour. She had raised her voice. The staff had remained calm. The policy was clear. But when control slipped from her hands, she looked for someone who couldn't speak, someone trained to remain still. And there he was, standing alone, red tunic pressed, metal edges gleaming, a man carved by discipline. And that discipline was the very thing she mistook for weakness. She approached with the gait of entitlement, the kind passed down, not earned, the kind that speaks first, listens last, and assumes silence is submission. "You," she said, "you will help me." He did not move. "You will listen." Still, nothing. Her voice sharpened, her tone cracked, and the quieter he remained, the louder she became. Not because she was powerful, but because something in his calm reflected everything she feared about herself. That her value might disappear the moment no one clapped back. She wasn't shouting at him. Not really. She was shouting at everything that wouldn't bend for her. at rules that didn't soften, at people who didn't flinch. And Edward, standing there, unmoved, became the mirror. The one she hadn't asked for. The one that doesn't distort. Her anger grew, but beneath it, there was fear. Not of him, but of something far more frightening. A question. What if silence isn't weakness? What if her voice, for all its volume, meant less than his stillness? What if power didn't sound like her? And so she reached for certainty, not through reason, but through dominance. She mocked him, called him decoration, said his medals were theater, his discipline an act. But each insult only made her voice more fragile, because deep down, she could feel it. This man wasn't pretending. He had seen something, carried something, something that could not be touched by her gestures or undone by her words. And that terrified her more than anything. The crowd had started to gather, not out of curiosity, but because something felt wrong. Not loud, just wrong. Her voice grew sharper, not stronger, just louder. And still, he stood. Still, he didn't speak. She circled him now. Her heels clicked like punctuation against the ancient stones. Her insults were not crafted. They were scattered, panicked. She reached into her handbag, not for understanding, but for proof. A business card, a name, a life lived through titles, printed in bold. Do you know who I am? But the silence didn't flinch. The uniform didn't shift. Even the medals remained perfectly still. That, somehow, made it worse. Because when pride meets something, it cannot move. It becomes rage. And rage cannot exist without noise. But noise dies in the presence of meaning. And that's what she had walked into. Not a performance, but a ritual. A ritual she could not interrupt. A man she could not reach. A silence she could not name. She called it theater, said it was all for show. The medals, the silence, the man. But there, beneath the fabric, was something real. Something she couldn't see. A scar, not quite healed. A rhythm, practiced, not performed. That uniform had been folded by hands that once shook beside a dying friend. Polished by fingers that still remembered the weight of loss. Buttoned each morning, not for ceremony, but for sanity. The silence she mocked was not hollow. It was held by a man who had buried noise in war zones. Held by someone who had shouted enough for a lifetime. This was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of survival. Because Edward Talmor had once knelt beside fire and chose to stand in peace. Because Edward Talmor had once stitched a uniform with trembling hands after carrying a brother home in pieces. Because Edward Talmor no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. She had called him decoration, but what she struck was a monument to restraint. It wasn't the slap that took him back. It was the sound of her certainty. That kind of voice. He had heard it before. Not from enemies, but from commanders who gave orders without counting the cost. From men who measured decisions in numbers, not names. He had stood in sand with a life in each hand. One soldier screaming, one no longer breathing. He had to choose. No medals for that. Just memory. Just the echo of a name he never told the mother. Just the weight of knowing he couldn't carry both. He never explained it. Because grief, in uniform, learns to zip its mouth tighter than its coat. But here, under the afternoon light, another decision arrived. Quieter, but heavier. A woman's hand, raised not to wound, but to diminish. And in that instant, his past whispered back, not again. Not another reaction. Not another injury. not another scar handed forward. He would not repeat what war had already taught him to leave behind. He chose not to drop the silence. Because sometimes, silence is the only thing left we still get to keep. The slap echoed, but only once. No gasp, no outrage, just quiet. Not the kind that follows embarrassment, but the kind that follows recognition that something had happened, something that couldn't be undone. Her hand still hovered in the air, suspended like her own certainty. His cheek reddened, but his posture remained perfect. His lips didn't tremble. His eyes didn't close. He simply stood. And that standing, that refusal to fall, became unbearable to witness. Children watched, not because they understood, but because something inside them did. The kind of moment that teaches long before it explains. "Why didn't he hit back?" a boy asked, his voice fragile in the air. His father said nothing, because there are answers that cannot be spoken without first becoming a man. And even then, some truths stay quiet forever. Edward didn't speak, but somehow everyone heard him, not in words, but in restraint, in discipline, in quiet pain that chooses not to multiply. The strongest thing he did was nothing. And that is what broke her. He didn't wipe the mark away, didn't even blink, because pain, real pain, doesn't always ask to be seen. Sometimes it chooses to be absorbed, quietly, so no one else has to carry it. That's what Edward did. He carried the moment, all of it, the insult, the weight, the watching, and he let it end with him. No retaliation, no defense, no need to explain himself. Because dignity, true dignity, is not something you protect. It's something you become. The woman began to retreat, her voice thinner now, her certainty no longer clinging to her. Around her the crowd said nothing, but their silence had changed. It was no longer confusion. It was reverence. A quiet respect for a man who had chosen to swallow what others would have thrown back. A man who made himself the end of harm. Not because he had no choice, but because he had one. He had every right to react, but he chose to stand. And in doing so, reminded everyone what strength was meant to look like. The woman was escorted out. No handcuffs, no shouting, just silence. The same silence she had tried to break, and failed. Edward resumed his stance, feet aligned, hands still, the mark on his cheek slowly fading. But something else remained. The moment, etched in memory, not just his, but ours. A moment where power didn't raise its voice, didn't return fire, didn't win, but chose not to lose itself. And in that moment, a question was left behind. Not for him, but for us. When someone chooses not to answer harm with harm, do we notice? Do we pause? Do we let it teach us? Or do we walk on, forgetting that the truest strength is often silent? That character is not declared. It's revealed in how we carry insult, in what we refuse to echo. He stood still, and in doing so, became the only voice that could not be interrupted. And the question now, for every one of us, is simple. Would you have done the same? In a world that rewards reaction, silence is often misunderstood, misread as passivity, dismissed as weakness. But silence, when chosen, is not absence. It is presence, with restraint. Some carry loud convictions. Others carry wounds they will never name. Not because they are ashamed, but because they have learnt that not every pain needs an audience. There comes a time in life, especially as we grow older, when we realize that dignity is not found in what we say, but in what we refuse to echo. It's not the loudest person in the room who teaches us the most. It's the one who holds their ground when no one's clapping. And perhaps the greatest legacy we can leave behind is not a victory shouted, but a kindness held. A moment where we could have struck back, but didn't. Not because we couldn't, but because we chose not to. That is what strength looks like when it grows old.